everyone, my name is Maryam Rasheed, and I'm a senior research analyst with Economist Impact's Policy and Insights team here in Dubai. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our session on the technical imperative of reaching net zero, where we'll be talking about natural capital, technology, and the responsibility to act. Before we get into this, I think it's fair to say that we're all very much in agreement that this topic is one that is incredibly timely, especially given a lot of the emerging data that we're seeing on the inability to achieve a low carbon world, sans the protection and restoration of natural capital. When we're discussing natural capital, we're really looking at the world's stock of its natural assets. So we're talking forests, rivers, oceans, and the like. That represent key ecosystems for us, as well as very critical carbon sinks. Just to get us started with some of the most recent data around this, it was found recently that land use change, primarily deforestation, contribute between 12 to 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions, while findings in the blue economy space have revealed a weakening of global ocean carbon storage. While this is quite concerning, we're looking to be quite solutions-oriented here. And we're here to discuss how industry is really responding to this crisis. And we're here to learn a little bit about what's being done to keep these resources in check. I will be your moderator today, and I will be joined by a wonderful and diverse set of panelists. We have Sibbe Krol, the Chief Sustainability Director at Bloom and Wild. We have Thomas Becker, the VP of Sustainability and Mobility at BMW, and Agustin Lopez Diaz, the Chief Sustainability and Customer Satisfaction and Quality Officer at Schneider Electric. So welcome, gentlemen. Let's jump right in and get started talking about how we've gotten to this place where we're really seeing natural capital's depletion potentially jeopardize our climate goals and targets. So Sibbe, if I could tap you in first, please. Just given agriculture's contribution to the planetary boundaries, and I'm talking mainly biodiversity, forest cover, freshwater consumption. I'm intrigued to hear your perspective on the factors, the realities, perhaps the technical shortcomings that have sort of led to this natural capital depletion and any material outcomes you're seeing either within your organization or your industry at large.
Yeah, thank you, Maryam. I think that's a really important question. So I think for a long time, when we talk about the way that we looked at agriculture, really yields and output reign supreme over any other type of consideration. And I think we're starting to realize and really starting to pivot towards a situation where we're much more considerate of all the different implications that can have, negative externalities that can have, and how to mitigate that and make a positive change. And the way that we looked at as an organization ourselves, I think, is also developing quite a lot. So historically, we've always been aware of the fact that there could be very negative biodiversity consequences from the way that we source our core product, which is mainly cut flowers and potted plants. And for us, we've tackled that in a couple of ways, which up until now have been relatively binary. So we look at whether or not growers have environmental certificates. We have certain quality and environmental standards that we adhere to, that we also really require for people in our supply chain. We have a banned substances list. So we also test against that in-house and with external laboratories to make sure that there are only acceptable usage of chemicals and pesticides and fertilizers in our products. And we try to ramp up also the organic portions of our range year on year, so that we see that there are growers who are not growing a monoculture, but actually a very diverse set of crops with crop rotation, with actually all types of ecosystem services that come from that, because they support actually the local ecosystems, which are very positive to see as well. And I think what's very interesting now is that that's given us a good baseline, and I think also a lot still to work on as a sector. But we're starting to see that change from that binary approach is getting much more granular and more detailed. And what's helping us here is that there's more and more insight thanks to tools like product environmental footprinting, where there's a life cycle assessment done on each individual type of flower and grower that's active in the sector, which looks at 18 different types of categories. So not just what your substance use is, but actually what is the impact that you're having on ecotoxicity, on water consumption, on land use. There's also ways to bring that back to specific scores, whether we're talking about a PEF score in and of itself or an environmental indicator for crop protection that considers substance use, but also how to mitigate that in other ways, looking at integrating hedgerows or addressing drift or all these types of practices. And that gives us much better nuanced and more quantitative data to not just say yes or no, it's meeting these environmental certification requirements, or it's not using the pesticides that we don't want to see. But actually we can see, okay, maybe this flower is a 6, whereas the other one is a 4. So then we can start to steer our choices year on year towards the more sustainable options. The way that we've been doing that also for more carbon intensive products, for example, where we've been introducing carbon budgets to steer away from the most carbon intensive products in our range and make positive changes happen that way.
Thank you so much for that, Sibbe. And I think you touched upon something incredibly critical. And whenever we talk about emissions, I think we're doing a disservice to the topic by excluding the fact that this is a whole value chain process and there are so many stakeholders involved in it, and there's so much reason to place onus on them to have these accreditations and to have these certifications in place, because it just transfers throughout the supply chain. With that, there was a piece of research that had appeared, I think towards the end of last year, that looked at transportation in particular and placed it in a sort of red zone when it came to exposure to natural capital risk. And one of the key factors that sort of brought it there was this notion of stakeholder pressure. So with that, perhaps Thomas, if you could speak to perhaps how you're seeing the industry respond to its exposure to natural capital risk and the crisis at large. Maybe talking a little bit about the industry's ability to measure and readily invest in nature to achieve net zero would be great.
Well, what we have been doing over the last 4 or 5 years is revisiting our strategic approach to our supply chain. Very clearly, from a pure carbon perspective, the focus of our impact is shifting from the product, from the exhaust pipe, into the materials that we use, into the components a car is made of. And the same applies to the impact on nature. From a climate perspective, Scope 1 and 2, our own operations are not even 1% of BMW's account anymore. And the focus becomes what we purchase. The reason why we have a strong strategic focus now on a circular economy, on higher rates of reuse of materials, is on the one hand driven by the fact that you can reduce the climate impact big deal if you don't need the early stages of the material life, which are the most energy intense. But this is also here where the impact on the environment more broadly happens, namely the indirect resource use that goes hand in hand with the use, namely of minerals, to a different extent. So there are very different multipliers between, let's say, mineral oil, plastics, and copper when it comes to the volume of earth that you need to move, to the energy that you need in order to extract metal from stone, to the volume of water that you need for these processes. So therefore, we think that the best approach for us to mitigate our impact on nature and on nature's ability to reduce carbon is using less primary material. Meaning replacing primary by secondary material. It is all the more important since we have an extremely complex supply chain. We have 9,000 direct suppliers and much more indirect ones. So it would be very hard for us to say, okay, I try to manage the impact really at the bottom of the pyramid, to try to define targets and measure what happens in terms of deforestation, in terms of water usage, etc., in all the places where somebody is extracting material from the earth for our products, which would be very, very many, and where we only own a tiny portion of the volume of what is happening. So for us, strategically speaking, it makes much more sense to say, how can we need less of that stuff in order to try to manage the impact at the other end of the chain. So this is how we are trying to approach things. We are thoroughly looking into the science of what makes the difference in the impact of different materials that we use. And there's almost no mineral that does not end up in a car somewhere. And we combine the carbon, the nature perspective with the risk mitigation perspective. Because another aspect that we need to take into account from a sustainability perspective is to question where is the likelihood highest for supply disruptions, for risks in terms of human rights, of nature protection, etc. So we try to have a comprehensive view on the criticality of our supplies and then prioritize accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that was another topic that seemed to come up whenever we came across something to do with natural capital, was really just the value of identifying those hotspots within the value chain, and how that is really rising to the top of a lot of business leaders' agenda. So it's great to hear that that's something that BMW is readily recognizing. And a lot of points you made there, Thomas, that sort of, again, touch upon this idea of the complexity of this issue, the interconnectivity of these issues, and then most importantly, the unintended consequences of this issue. I think there was this report that the WBCSD released last year that highlighted that energy companies' operations, so generation, transmission, and the like, are in fact very highly impacted by natural infrastructure. They cited things like precipitation patterns and looking at their impact on hydropower, wildfire risk, and the safety of grid assets and things like that. So you really see this like mutual loop of responsibility and impact taking place within each and every one of at least the industries represented here, right? And with that, Augustine, if I could tap you in and look at it in a little bit more of a technical lens, which very rightly, Thomas, you'd mentioned, there is this complexity in sort of measuring and sort of defining the value. And so if we are to talk numbers here, I'd like to talk about the data factor and understand, at least in the energy space, what has been the impact or the outcome of pricing and measurement of these natural assets. Is this something that is still a major obstacle to overcome? Are there frameworks appearing to render this a little bit more streamlined for the industry? And yeah, just to sort of understand valuing natural capital at large.
Well, I mean, for us, it's been, as Thomas said, it's really an end-to-end equation, right? So when we look at how do we measure and value the impact of our operation and the impact that we bring to our customers, it's incredibly important to look at it from an end-to-end view. So I'll say probably a couple or three things. Number one, as it was correctly mentioned by Thomas, upstream is absolutely critical. We launched last year a program that we call Zero Carbon Project, where we partnered with our key suppliers, about 1,000 of them, and assessing what is the impact of all these natural aspects, the measure of carbon footprint, and how does that have a drive into their operation. So we created this project in order for us to create a culture of end-to-end partnership with our suppliers, where we help them assess, evaluate, and commit to some actions to decarbonize. So our target is by 2025 to decrease 50% of the carbon footprint in the supply base. The biggest challenge for us, though, comes in the energy sector on how do we evaluate and evaluate the solutions that we bring into the energy supply and demand. To give you for instance, for us, everything that we do in the company, it's all about saving and avoiding emissions for our customers. It is true that there are several frameworks that are starting to come out to be able to evaluate not only the scope 3 emissions downstream, but also, the effect that we bring with our solutions to our customers. In this sense, we continue to drive about 80% of our revenues towards the creation of sustainable solutions that will be able to provide the customers that stability of the grid and also the decarbonization at the same time, while we produce all of these synergies at minimum cost, right? So we believe that the equation has to be such that we drive sustainable technologies while we respect, the cost structure of the execution. So for the past years, Schneider has centered its strategy around the creation of what we call EcoStructure, which is an end-to-end view, where we look at, the operation of the customers. We evaluate all the data coming in, and we create this real-time execution to be able to provide information that is actionable for our customers. So in this sense, we strongly believe that our center, our key technology and purpose has to be centered around driving a decarbonization and possibility of access of information to our customers real time through connectivity and digitization to be able to create these solutions of decarbonization in a cost-effective manner. So that's how we think about it. How do we, affect? It's important to note, as we know, that 70% of the impact in climate change is due to the demand. So we are really focused on, helping solutions both in the execution of the grid, in providing infrastructure that will help, the transition into a hybrid model of the grid where we have a centralized and decentralized supply. But we really, most of it drives solutions that create value in an efficient manner for the efficiency. I think in the context of all of this, Maryam, what we really want to strive for is to enable the pledge that was set by COP28, where we center in two aspects: tripling the renewable energies and doubling the efficiency of the execution. So in this sense, Schneider is centered on creating these possibilities for our customers. So, in spite of everything that's going on, all the structure, the risk associated of the execution, the depletion of the natural resources, we drive these solutions that are efficient and cost-effective, that are based on data, artificial intelligence, and connectivity of products. So in this sense, it is our purpose to drive this energy transition and to help our customers to connect this transition into renewables and efficiency of demand.
That's really interesting that in terms of the data framework, the focus is awareness. I think that there is very often sometimes a greater focus placed on, providing that figure, but there is a sort of subjective awareness that can come from providing insights that I think that is great to be bringing to the table, especially when it comes to the fact that stakeholders do have such different priorities when it comes to things like natural capital and the achieving of net zero. And also, Agustin, you have given me my new favorite sustainability term. I'm going to use EcoStructure ad nauseum for the next few weeks. So thank you so much for that. And I think that places us in a very good place to begin really getting into, as you gentlemen have rightly brought up in your discussions, the corporate plays and corporate strategies that are really being implemented right now to attain net zero. So in light of that, just to share a statistic with the group before I get into my question, So some research has come out recently to demonstrate that on average, nature positive actions could bring a combined value opportunity of around $700 billion to global commerce annually through reduced operating costs. But given this figure, it is fair to assume that this journey is not without significant expenses as well. So I do have a question to the group, and that is, in your experience within your industry, how compatible are you seeing business growth with the preservation of natural assets? Rather, what is the cost of inaction for your sector amidst the natural capital crisis? Perhaps, Thomas, if you'd like to go first, I can see that you may have something to say.
How I can explain a little bit how we approach things. What we do is we allocate targets to our products. So the first step is to have a corporate target being set, be it for the CO2 footprint of a new car, or be it for its secondary material rate. So coming from the corporate level, we get targets for product lines, for individual derivatives, and then for purchasing commodities. That means that we have a target breakdown, which leads to a job being done by, for example, a steel purchasing expert to reach a certain level of performance in terms of CO2 footprint and in terms of secondary material content. This then goes into the negotiation with our supply chain partners, and we try, obviously, to get the biggest benefit for the euro we only get once from our customers. So at the end of the day, what we try is to steer by impact or by impact relevant numbers like secondary material rate and CO2 footprint in order to get the best out of what we spend. So we do not have a pricing logic saying there is a single price that steers our activities, but we come from a volume logic and then optimize according to cost per impact, so to speak. Over the last years, we have been seeing that this works, and it means that in many cases you can have more or less automatic decisions, but in important cases, namely ones where things could get expensive, you have to escalate and you have to take individual decisions. But I think for us, and given the complexity of our supply chain, it works better than, let's say, simulating a market by setting prices. I cannot generalize that. I just would like to outline how it works for us at the moment.
That's fair. That's fair. I think that in terms of a lot of what we're seeing in the realm of natural capital management in the corporate sector, this linking of KPIs, ensuring that sustainability KPIs are not mutually exclusive to business KPIs is definitely something that we're seeing. Agustin, are there any similar or notable other approaches being taken by Schneider?
Sure. Well, I mean, in addition, obviously, to Thomas' points, which are also very relevant to us as well, I'll probably give a different perspective on how do we think about our development of the offers, right? So we've been since now several years integrating in our eco design practices, the notion of the carbon footprint allocation and circularity. So just to give you one example, we have two of our products, our drives and our breakers, that now come with a QR code where customers can scan them and see automatically all the possibility of information about the history of the product, the usage of the product. So we can create or enable our customers to drive usage-based maintenance. This is aiming to extend the life of the products, the use life of the products, driving both efficiency for our customers, but more importantly, even a reduction of the impact to the environment. So I think that's number one. Additionally, again, just going back to this EcoStructure, infrastructure that we have created in the company, we are really creating a significant amount of developments around driving efficiency in buildings. For instance, we work very actively with several operating companies of buildings to drive efficiency, and we have seen consistently, reduction of 20 to 30% of energy usage. Of course, driving significant savings while reducing carbon footprint. One of the examples is our building in Grenoble in France, which is one of the cleanest buildings in the world, and it uses about 1/5 of the average energy of the buildings in Europe. So I think from a Schneider standpoint, we're centered around driving that efficiency at the design phase, and really creating a collaborative approach with both our customers and our supply chain. So just from a technology standpoint, what we have committed by 2025 is to create a portfolio of products where well over 80% of our portfolio is centered on solutions that will help decarbonizing and driving higher level of efficiency. And lastly, and then I'll hand it back to you. But lastly, one of the things that we center on is partnerships with different companies. We have partnered recently with Solar Impulse, which is an independent organization that drives the certification of products. So we have submitted several of our offers to be evaluated both in terms of driving higher level of efficiency and therefore lower carbon footprint, but also providing an end-to-end lower cost. And in this sense, we do believe strongly in Schneider that we don't have to compromise as companies. We can drive higher level of efficiency, lower footprint, while we drive profits and sustainable execution for our company. So that's what we're centered on.
Understood. And as we are talking about more nature-based solutions, Sibbe, I wanted to inquire about whether you were able to perhaps speak to corporate actions that you undertake to support natural capital and that are exhibiting a net positive rate of return. And sort of why this is coming up is there is research to suggest that attaining our climate goals cannot occur without nearly double the current investment in natural-based solutions. So I'm intrigued to see what you guys are up to.
Yeah, thanks for that, Maryam. So I think maybe first to come back on also your earlier point on how to go about this from a corporate governance standpoint. I think Thomas and Agustin already rightly addressed the importance of data and setting targets and KPIs. And I think this also really goes towards systems change. How do we move as an industry and as a society towards a different way of conducting business? And there, I also think it's good to address that for this kind of systems change, collaboration is also really vital. And that's both internal and external collaboration. So when it comes to internal collaboration, I think an important function that businesses need to adopt is to really align sustainability goals and sustainability metrics with other business incentives, compensations, targets, in a way that actually makes this a much more complementary and win-win type of situation. And we see actually that by embracing sustainability targets and challenges, we've unlocked lots of other business benefits in terms of innovations, improving customer relations, being ahead of the curve in terms of improving what's coming up in terms of regulatory space. So we've actually seen ourselves become a better business by adopting sustainability challenges and principles. And I think the other part of it is the external collaboration to drive change, is that we also very actively seek to collaborate with other peers in our sector, with NGOs, with governments, with lots of different partners and stakeholders to drive towards change and to also create a common language and common expectations around what good looks like and what kind of sustainability requirements we want to set. And that not only creates a bigger movement, it also creates more clarity on what we want to achieve, and therefore focuses less attention on monitoring or measuring for all kinds of different standards, but actually moving towards action, towards clear goals that are adopted by broad groups of stakeholders within a sector. And that actually can then therefore accelerate and scale the kind of good movements that we're seeing. And I think indeed, when it comes to the floriculture sector in particular, it's quite interesting to see what kind of opportunities are there when we adopt nature-based solutions. There's quite a lot of different things that we do. And sometimes it's not even radically new what we have to do. We just have to go back in time sometimes and adopt some of the good practices that used to exist and re-embrace them. Or we need to think about how to scale up good solutions that already exist. I think when it comes to growing practices, what's a really nice example is that we see increasing growers in our supply chain who actually combine the growing of flowers with orchards, which is a really nice win-win because the orchards attract birds, the birds eat snails, which improves the yields from the flowers, and the flowers actually attract pollinating insects that improve the yields from the orchard, which is actually, going back in time in the way that we used to work with smaller crops maybe or more rotations, but actually creating a lot of positive impacts. What we also see is that within the sector, there's really good movements in using what's called integrated pest management. And what that means is that we use the good bugs to fight the bad bugs. So you use predatory mites, or you try to bring in other types of predators who eat the pests that otherwise would damage the crops. And that can actually make a very significant change in how much you need to use pesticides or other types of chemicals, which therefore has a much lower or no impact on the biodiversity and the ecosystem that we're looking at. So that's very much looking at it from a grower standpoint. And then throughout the extended supply chain, there's, I think, also lots of opportunities to work on other ways that we can adopt good technology practices that are becoming more and more commonplace. When it comes to the heating of greenhouses, we see the scaling of geothermal energy as a very positive and very impactful change that's happening. We also see that by shifting from air freight to sea freight, which is quite complicated at first when you have such a perishable crop, is actually achieving a 90% reduction in the carbon footprint of a lot of our products, which already are typically relatively low. So it can actually mean that we're very far along in our net zero journey as we start to hit these targets. And the technical feasibility is actually already there. So then for us as a business, an important part that we can play is to destigmatize it and to incentivize it and to create the right kind of terms and conditions to make that thrive and to make that more of a commonplace. Where again, this collaboration point keeps being an important part to make that transition happen.
No, and I think you make a wonderful point, both with the collaboration and the fact that nature-based solutions don't necessarily need to be the most digitized or the most technologically like industry 5.0 solutions out there, but really it is these changes that are cost effective, that can be monetized upon. And again, I would assume that these are actions that do have a very favorable rate of investment. And yeah, it's great to see examples like that in play. But I would like to ask the group now whether, based on their experience, they believe that there are sufficient frameworks, partnerships in the spirit of collaboration, taxonomies and the like, to guide your industry in incorporating nature-based solutions such as these, nature tech, into your operations. And if there could be improvement, where are we going to see that? But this is a question for the group, so do feel free.
I
Agustin,
can take a stab at it.
Yes.
Sure. Well, so I mean, there's always balanced equation between framework and regulation, and structure, and make sure that we don't overcompensate. And while we could benefit from some taxonomies that will help structure, for instance, in our case, the evaluation of the saved and avoided emissions, which is really critical as we are evaluating the goodness and the positive impact of our solutions. I think regulators overall have to be very mindful on creating frameworks and infrastructures that don't necessarily impose so much burden into companies that would go in detriment to the willingness to drive transparency and therefore actions. So, Maryam, I think Taxonomies are needed to make sure that there are stable and consistent ways to approach it, especially as it pertains to the evaluation of the products. At the same time, we urge quite openly, regulators to make sure that when they are thinking about infrastructure and regulations, they really make it in a way that that enables and incentivizes companies that are really trying to go and work really, really hard in driving sustainability at the core of the operation. So it has to be, really the perfect balance between an infrastructure and a regulatory framework that will enable comparison and transparency, but at the same time, giving some degree of flexibility and possibility for companies to not be overburdened with the needs. So I think, if I will summarize it, is infrastructures, frameworks, taxonomies, and regulatory frameworks that will help us be consistent, transparent, but also very efficient.
I like that idea that you mentioned now of flexibility, because again, ultimately in this discussion, we're looking to see how best we can empower companies to take a more bold role in preserving natural capital and ultimately preserving their life cycle and working a little bit more for the community. And as we're drawing to the end of our discussion, I think one of the things that we need to acknowledge is that this idea of a nature positive net zero future is one that is fundamentally disruptive. It is forcing corporate systems to think very differently about how they manufacture and deliver goods and services. And in doing that, I just wanted to bring one last question to the group, which was to really understand the feasibility of the targets that we've set in place to, one, preserve biodiversity, to preserve fresh water, to preserve natural assets, as well as attain that net zero. Is it feasible? What is the role of a business leader in making that a reality? What is the role of governance in making that a reality? And what is the role of customers and investors in making that a reality? So to the team, maybe Thomas, if you'd like to give that a go first.
Let me try to make a comparison between carbon and biodiversity. In the carbon field, we have been able over the last years to really establish, I think, effective steering mechanisms. We have created a relatively high level of transparency. We have the challenge now for complex supply chains like ours to replace working with average data by primary data to get ever more precise information along the chain about the real impact that a certain element of the supply chain has. But we have one thing here which misses in the other nature-related dimensions, and this is the common denominator of the ton of CO2 equivalent. Everything that we do with the view to decarbonization is based on this currency. And today, I would not be able to prioritize between the deforestation in Indonesia and water usage in Chile. So the question, how can I rate, how can I classify, how can I measure, in the extreme case, the impact on nature beyond carbon is unanswered. And therefore, I think the simplified perception that I meet in some conversations, hey, we just do it exactly like we did it with carbon, we just replace CO2 by biodiversity. This will not work. So we will need a much more differentiated discussion. How can I do the right things, take the right decisions, presumably for a while, in the absence of one internationally accepted measurement methodology. And this is no reason for doing nothing. It is a reason for saying, let's ask ourselves what we can do, namely use less stuff. And on the other hand, how can we collaborate to create a more broadly accepted calculation basis, like we have it in the climate agenda now since quite some while.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely a perspective, and I think as many insights we can get on this, the better. But Sibbe, Augustine, if there are any other perhaps facets or elements that we need to really look to equip company leaders with in this fostering of a nature positive net zero future.
Yeah, I think Thomas raises a really important point that it's not going to be a binary decision. It's not going to be a straightforward comparison as we have with the carbon intensity of certain products. I do think what gives me hope is that if we look at certain methodologies that are coming out there, and I think the European Union is doing a lot in creating these product environmental footprinting rules to look at a lot of different types of categories of biodiversity impacts, which actually come back to fairly single metrics. It's not a perfect system, but it's a good way to start to understand what are the impacts and how do they somewhat compare to each other. And I think it's inherent in this field that we'll always have some trade-offs, whether they're between indeed freshwater use versus deforestation, or maybe in one area you have the lowest environmental impacts, but there could be much more complicated human rights considerations to manage. So I think there's not going to be a perfect solution or a perfect metric, but I do think we're getting better and better at creating a common framework, a common methodology. And then I think there's a real need also to get together and to work together with governments, with businesses, with academia, NGOs, everybody, to make sure that we also have long-term commitments, a long-term view, and a real drive towards positive change, where I think in particular business also can play a role in getting out of the gates quickly, moving now, creating innovations, creating solutions, so that we can take what works and start to scale that as soon as we can, because there's urgent action needed. And I think right now we know enough to at least start making the right moves and to then further quantify that and ideate beyond that in the coming years.
Mm-hmm. And Augustine, what would you perhaps suggest to companies at the cusp of making this change? How would you best empower them to sort of participate in, as Sibbe, you mentioned, those conversations with our regulators, with our academia, and really start to understand that there are plenty of frameworks available, even though it is a budding field. How would you explain to them that now is the time to really act?
Well, I really want to probably offer a different perspective, just building on both Thomas's and Sibbe's point. When we look at the solutions that we're putting in place, and we can help it but understand that every aspect, every impact that we create always reflects higher and stronger in communities that are more vulnerable, right? I believe last year there was an excess of 20 million that were displaced from their communities because of impact that has generated from other economies. So when we think about it, we like to think about it in the just transition framework. And one of the things that we are working on as a company, and that we believe that this is just one step that we all have to take in our companies, is what we call access to energy. So Schneider created an organization, a division, a product business that is centered on offering access to energy to communities that are off-grid. We believe in Schneider that electricity, it's a human right. It's a must for development and for providing people capability to progress. So what we are doing is creating a set of products that are aimed for communities that do not have otherwise access to clean energy, especially solar inverters and microgrids and so on and so forth. And the intent is to really enable that transition into the new landscape. So in addition to what it was said by both Thomas and Sibbe, I think it's important that companies, NGOs, and regulators understand, we all collectively understand, that we take action, more importantly, in addressing the gap that climate is driving, both in impact of vulnerable communities, but also enabling the possibility for progress without or minimizing as best as we can the impact in this journey. So again, the just transition framework to us is one of the ways to add into this ethical behavior that Sibbe was alluding to, both in providing access to clean energy to everybody. And we are committed to do that by 2025. We believe that we will be addressing and providing access to over 50 million people around the world. And also we are committed to drive training and providing possibilities for accessing this information to young generations and sectors that are less prone to be able to have that understanding of the clean access. So for me, to be quite honest with you, I think it's all of us together, and every single one of us, communities, NGOs, companies, we have to take an action decisively, and that action has to be really balanced across the board in our supply chain, in our stakeholders, but also in the communities that we operate.
I think that this is such a fine note to end on, because I think that very often in the conversations around natural capital and net zero, there's this whole idea of the tragedy of commons that comes up. But there really is so much strength in looking at it in terms of the potential of the commons and then the opportunity of the commons, and retaining that that community-focused approach to understanding that this is an issue that affects us all, and this is an issue that if we are given a stake in, really has so much potential all around. And I think that's a wonderful note to end on. It's great to see that while corporates' awareness of natural capital footprint is really increasing, there's a lot of acknowledgement that more can be done and more is being done. It was amazing to hear how much is being done. And yeah, very much looking forward to how industry continues to gauge its role in mitigation, engages its role in really advancing a new way of doing business. So once again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your insights. They've been incredibly illuminating.